A flight attendant mishandled a black CEO's newborn mid-flight, but he had no idea the father was about to turn the situation completely around. A flight attendant dropped a black CEO's newborn from his own private jet stairs. Thinking the father's shock would keep him silent, he didn't realize he had just triggered revenge so precise and powerful that the entire aviation world would feel it. The moment that infant slipped, the countdown to destruction began. Subscribe if you believe arrogance always collapses when true power wakes up. We've got to fall. Rear stairwell, baby down. The voice sliced through the cabin like a blade. It came not from the intercom, but from the co-pilot himself, shouting with raw panic. Dr. Toren Vallis, strapped into his recliner near the left-wing viewport, froze. The words didn't register at first. They sounded impossible. But then his heart snapped to life like a detonator. He unbuckled and surged to his feet, the world narrowing to a single, echoing phrase. Baby down. His son, Corven. The aisle seemed longer than it ever had. Toren sprinted down it, shoving past startled crew, his mind blanking out everything except the desperate need to reach that stairwell. The aircraft was still in ascent, 30,000 feet, and climbing. G-forces tilted his balance, but his legs didn't stop. He could feel the vibration underfoot, the subtle hum of pressure differentials meeting stress metal. As he rounded the corner past the catering bulkhead, he saw him, Kellen Dray, standing alone, ghost-pale, beside the open stairwell hatch. Wind howled faintly from the pressure seal gap. Kellen's hands were trembling, one still stretched outward as if he'd just released something. Toren's eyes dropped. At the base of the narrow service stairwell, half-shadowed in the dim emergency floor lights, was a small form, white blanket, arms flailing, a broken cry piercing through the steel. Corven. Toren's breath hitched. He lunged forward, but the stairwell hatch slammed shut without warning, a system-triggered seal from the pressure anomaly. His fist hammered against the emergency panel, slapping the override sensor. The delay felt eternal. Finally, with a hiss and a click, the hatch released. He descended 3 steps at a time. Corven was still crying, still alive. Toren dropped to his knees, cradling him in trembling arms. The baby was bruised, his tiny wrist bent unnaturally, but his chest rose and fell. Alive. Toren's entire body sagged in a collapse of relief and rage. The first technician to arrive doubled over and vomited in the stairwell corner. The other crew member froze, unable to speak. Only Kellen moved backward, slightly, as if trying to fade from view. I didn't mean. Kellen's voice was quiet, oddly flat. I slipped. Toren's gaze snapped to him, blood rushing in his ears. He stared at the man's posture. No blood on his uniform, no sweat on his forehead, and his voice wasn't panicked. It wasn't even defensive. It was rehearsed. You slipped. Toren echoed, rising with Corven in his arms. He stared at the stairwell floor, then back at Kellen. The incline was shallow. Nothing jagged, nothing unstable. Toren remembered every angle of that corridor. And he remembered something else too, the brief hesitation before he handed Corven over. Kellen hadn't asked like a concerned attendant. He'd waited. He'd positioned himself behind Toren's dominant shoulder. How did you get to the stairwell that fast? Toren asked, his voice low, controlled. Kellen blinked. Said nothing. Why weren't you near the cockpit when the co-pilot called out? Still no answer. Toren turned away, holding his son tighter. Lock the cabin. He barked to the crew behind him. Nobody leaves. Nobody speaks. He activated the comm on his wrist console. This is Dr. Vallis. Command override. Divert course. Emergency return to Norvane Strip. Priority Alpha. There was a pause, then confirmation from the cockpit. Back in his seat, Toren wrapped Corven in a fresh thermal blanket and laid him across his chest. He felt every flutter of the baby's breath, every tremor in those fragile limbs. His mind ran loops, timing, spacing, angles, intentions. Something was off, deeply off. Kellen remained seated near the galley bulkhead, flanked by 2 silent crew members. He didn't protest, didn't panic. He just sat there, muttering quietly to himself, something about balance, about tired hands. But Toren watched him with the precision of a man who built security frameworks for governments. And he saw the truth not in the words, but in what they lacked: fear. This wasn't carelessness, Toren whispered to himself, tightening his grip on his son. This was deliberate. The scream from the cockpit hadn't finished echoing when Toren Vallis surged to his feet. The jet tilted slightly under its ascent, but his footing didn't waver. Instinct had taken over, an ancient reflex older than strategy, older than language. The corridor between the leather recliners blurred as he charged forward, the roar of the engines suddenly drowned by the singular sound of his heart, slamming against his chest like a war drum. Ahead, the service stairwell stood open. Cold wind hissed through the sealed pressure gradient, tugging at the edges of the fuselage. Kellen Dray was not at the cockpit as protocol demanded. Instead, he stood at the edge of the stairwell, frozen, arms loose at his sides, face pale. His mouth hung slightly open, but no words came out. Just silence. And then Toren saw him, Corven. The baby lay crumpled near the base of the stairwell, just above the reinforced cargo lock chamber, cocooned in the white cloth Toren had wrapped him in earlier. He was moving, crying, but the sound was faint, almost swallowed by the whine of the engines and the sheer terror that seized Toren's spine. The sight tore something raw and guttural from within him. He didn't scream. He didn't shout. He just moved. One of the flight techs stumbled forward, saw the infant, and promptly vomited against the pressurized wall. Another tried to close the stairwell hatch, but the system resisted. It had been manually overridden. Toren slammed the emergency code into the nearby wall panel. Override manual lock. Code Vallis Echo 27. The green light blinked once. Then again, with a hiss of metal and pneumatics, the stairwell door slammed shut just as a tremor rocked the plane, a sudden turbulence drop jolting everyone sideways. The sound of impact and the baby's brief wail nearly collapsed Toren to his knees. But he was there now. Toren reached the cradle of the stairwell and scooped Corven into his arms with a movement so delicate it defied the fury beneath it. The child was bruised, his tiny wrist bent unnaturally, but alive. Warm, breathing, crying. Toren pressed his forehead against the child's and exhaled through clenched teeth, the relief like a blade sheathed in fire. His hands trembled, not with weakness, but with the weight of what could have been. He turned. Kellen was still at the top of the stairwell, now backed against the wall as two technicians moved to restrain him. His eyes darted, not with fear, but calculation, the kind that tries to form a story before the questions arrive. "I didn't mean to," Kellen stammered. His voice was too level, too rehearsed. I slipped." Toren studied him. The tone wasn't panic. It was detached, as if he were describing a spilled glass of water. There was no urgency in his hands, no reaching toward the child, no instinctive movement a man would make after a mistake so catastrophic. Instead, Kellen's arms hung slack, the kind of slack that comes after a task completed. "You slipped," Toren asked softly, eyes narrowing. His voice was quiet, lethal. "Where?" "Show me." Kellen looked down, blinked hard, as though willing himself to appear distraught. On the edge, the stairwell, my boot, but Toren had already seen it. The floor panel was dry. No skid marks, no dampnis, no dislocated mats. His mind, trained by decades of defense protocols and human behavioral analysis, dissected every frame in real time. The precision of the fall, the angle of the cloth unraveling, the positioning of Kellen's feet. It didn't align with a stumble. It aligned with intent. The lead technician approached Toren. "Sir," he said, voice shaking, should we initiate an emergency descent?" Toren didn't respond immediately. He held Corven closer, cradling the fragile weight of him with one arm as he activated the comm on the nearest wall panel with the other. "This is Dr. Vallis. KR-1V will reroute. Set vector for Norvane Strip. Immediate descent. Notify Norvane Private Wing of incoming pediatric emergency." A silence followed across the channel, broken only by the cockpit's clipped reply. "Understood. Diverting now." Toren turned back to Kellen, who had not moved. Stay exactly where you are, he said. If you so much as blink wrong, I will bury you in a flight protocol violation, so deep you'll need sonar to hear your rights. As Kellen was restrained and pulled aside, Toren returned to his seat, Corven's cries fading into hiccuped exhaustion. He settled the child against his chest once again. His hands were steady now, cold, focused. Inside his mind, connections began to thread. Not just what had happened, but how. The override on the stairwell. The timing. The fact that Kellen had been hired by a partner firm with minimal vetting. The oddity in the man's background check that Toren had dismissed in favor of protocol efficiency. It wasn't just incompetence. This had been constructed. The plane banked gently toward Norvane Bay. Sunlight slanted across the clouds like a parting curtain. But in Toren's eyes, it was no longer sunrise. It was the glow of exposure. He looked down at his son, sleeping now against his chest. This wasn't carelessness, he murmured aloud, though the words were for himself, for the darkness gathering behind his gaze. This was deliberate. Toren Vallis watched the slow-motion footage for the 7th time, his eyes fixed, unblinking, as if burning the image into his memory would somehow reverse the damage. The feed showed it clearly now. Kellen Dray didn't stumble. He pivoted, subtle, controlled. His right heel lifted in a precise angle, his body rolled at the hip, and the baby, Toren's baby, slipped from his grasp with chilling calculation. Corven, bundled in soft white, twisted midair before the frame cut out. The security feed stopped just short of impact, but Toren already knew the outcome. He'd seen it in real time. He'd held the bruised, broken little arm in his hands. Outside the office door, soft whirring sounds filled the silence. Machines monitoring Corven's vital signs from the neonatal cradle placed in Norvane's private medical wing. The lighting was dim, filtered through smart glass panels. But in Toren's office, the glow of the footage cast stark shadows against the brushed steel walls. A soft knock came. It was Malik Renner, Chrysonic CTO, holding a secure tablet. I pulled the flight override logs, he said quietly, placing the device on the desk beside Toren. There's a 6-second delay between biometric disengagement and emergency re-authentication. Sir, someone injected code into the cradle's lockout. It didn't just fail, it was bypassed. Toren's fingers flexed slowly against the armrest of his chair. Could it have been accidental? No, sir. Malik hesitated. It required credentials with top-tier access and cross-signatures. This wasn't a mistake. It was authorization, intentional, strategic. Only a handful of tokens exist that could have triggered it. He didn't need to say more. Toren tapped the tablet. Streams of code scrolled upward, overlaid with timestamps, location pins, and digital fingerprints. One pattern repeated, a sequence matching Chrysonic's internal encryption keys supposedly known only to executives or their designated security engineers. The silence deepened. Then Toren leaned forward, his voice low. So whoever did this had access to my family's biometric shell, the same system I designed to protect us. Malik gave a grim nod. And sir, there's more. He swiped to another panel. This fragment here, it's a secondary call. A reroute command meant to delay the cradle's shock alert. But the insertion ID, it's not from our domain. It was pushed in externally. Toren stood slowly. His reflection in the screen stared back at him, older somehow. Tired. Angrier. A foreign key? Who? We don't know yet. But we'll find out. Toren turned toward the cradle in the next room. Corven's small chest rose and fell in the faint blue glow of the medical light. His left wrist was wrapped in a stabilizer, and even though he slept now, Toren could still see the flinch he gave each time a nurse approached, tiny, unconscious, wounded trust. The pain twisted inside him like a wire being pulled tighter. But it wasn't just pain anymore. It was purpose. Pull all archive partner logs, Toren ordered. Start with the aviation contractor who placed Kellen. Then backtrace every linked credential that's touched our cradle protocol in the last 6 months. Malik nodded and disappeared. Toren returned to the footage. He paused it on the frame just before the drop. Kellen's face wasn't panicked. It was calm, mechanical. His grip loosened like someone letting go of a burden. No urgency. Notigrit. He reached for the other screen and pulled up another file. His wife's name, Toren Vallis. The security logs from a month before her fatal car malfunction were still archived, encrypted under a grief lock that Toren had never opened. Until now, it took less than 10 seconds for the first anomaly to show. A tampered navigation override, flagged but unresolved. An emergency brake relay rerouted through a remote diagnostic update, triggered 2 days before a crash. Toren didn't breathe. It couldn't be coincidence. Someone had breached their inner circle. Not once, twice, both times targeting the heart of him. He stepped away from the desk, standing now at the edge of the cradle. Corven stirred, as if sensing his father nearby. The baby's fingers flexed around empty air, then curled into a soft fist. Toren's own hand clenched slowly in response. He activated the embedded camera across from him, voice steady but razor-edged. "Record," he said. A red dot blinked on. Toren stared directly into the lens. "They didn't just drop my son," he said, his voice low, calm, measured. "They infiltrated our defenses, broke sacred trust, abused proximity." His eyes hardened. "They think power means silence," he continued, jaw tightening. "But this time they touched what I live for." Kellen was detained before he could even change out of his uniform. 2 private security agents met him as he stepped out of the jet's debriefing chamber, their movements coordinated, deliberate. "Kellen Dray," one said, voice like gravel on steel, "you're being placed under investigative hold pending further instruction." The man didn't resist. He didn't speak. His eyes flicked once to the jet, once to the cameras, and then down to his own palms, as if he still felt the weight of Corven in them. Toren watched from a secure observation window as the agents led Kellen through the corridor. He didn't blink. He didn't flinch. His jaw was clenched so tightly that the muscle along his cheek pulsed like a drumbeat. A medic brushed past him without apologizing. Toren didn't care. All he could see was Kellen's hollow calmness, the artificial slump of his shoulders, as if trying to perform remorse. It wasn't real. None of it was. Within the hour, Kellen had lawyered up. Not just any lawyer, an entire litigation phalanx dispatched from Veltrin and Marrow, a corporate law firm whose name was whispered in closed-door merger wars and hostile takeovers. They didn't represent the innocent. They didn't arrive unless someone powerful had sent for them. Toren's security chief, Ridden Mar, appeared in the hallway with a tablet in hand. "Sir," he said quietly, "backup surveillance nodes 3 and 4 have been wiped." Toren looked at him without blinking. "Ow! Override protocols." It wasn't amateur. 2 deletion commands ran within 7 seconds of each other. Someone knew what they were doing and what they were after. The hallway seemed colder now, narrower. Every step Kellen had taken on that plane, every glance, every offer choreographed. Toren nodded slowly. "Then we're not dealing with a man," he said. "We're dealing with a message." That evening, he called an emergency audit. His office was converted into a war room. No assistants, no PR, just his core security board, 6 men, all trusted, all with pasts that didn't exist in public bios. Each had followed Toren into mergers where threats weren't metaphorical. On a shared screen, Ridden projected the hiring files for Kellen Dray. The reference letter was pristine. Too pristine. The metadata on the digital header didn't match Chrysonic's encrypted template. A forged signature. A header domain routed through a shell company. "Who issued this?" Toren asked. One of the analysts, a young but sharp-eyed systems crawler named Leonard Vale, leaned forward. "The letter came from a subcontracting firm called Travison Holdings. Paper trail says they supply private aviation staff for elite fleets, but we ran a deeper trace." He tapped twice. A new name appeared. Corven Aero Trust. The room went silent. Everyone knew that name. Brevik Thorn, Ridden murmured. He was Corven's EVP of cybersecurity until last year. Suspended after the leak to Haver Systems. Toren's voice was low. He vanished after that. "Not quite vanished," Leonard said, zooming in on the holding pattern. "He reappeared here, hired quietly by Travison. No photo, no digital signature. But one buried email thread confirms he approved staffing Kellen Dray." Toren sat back in his chair. The entire room held its breath. Brevik Thorn, the man once charged with securing aircraft passenger data, had now turned phantom, placing operatives on his jet. Not just any jet, his jet. The one carrying his son. He stood, slowly, with precision. "They didn't just try to hurt my son," he said, his voice as steady as steel cooling under pressure. "They're probing the blind spots we buried in layers of trust." There was a weight in the room. Something irreversible had just passed through them all. Toren walked to the far wall, tapped on the security-grade glass once, then turned back to face the men who had stood with him through acquisitions, failed coups, and recovery missions. His eyes met theirs. "No preambid, no performance. Find out who else touched this file," he said, "and burn the chain from the bottom up." The camera light blinked red. Recording. Toren Vallis sat beside Corven's recovery bed, the hospital room dim but steady with the soft beep of monitors. He didn't look tired, though he hadn't slept. His gaze was unwavering, sharp. In one hand, he held a simple tablet. In the other, he gently rested his fingers on the edge of Corven's cradle. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Someone in our airspace crossed a line that no boardroom, no rivalry, no profit curve ever justifies, he said, looking into the lens. "I'm not pursuing revenge. I am conducting an audit of truth." The video ended seconds later. No music, no branding, just clarity and fire. Within 24 hours, it had been shared over 6 million times. Corporate forums lit up. Industry analysts scrambled. Shareholders speculated nervously. But Toren wasn't reading the comments. He was in a secure briefing room, deep beneath Chrysonic Dynamics' Norvane facility, staring at a digital wall of names, files, and timelines. Across from him, Darren Cray, a former military analyst with a mind like steel wire, clicked through the data projections. "We've traced Kellen's last 3 offshore comms. One pinged a private relay in Parnix. The other 2 were routed through a server farm linked to Corven Aero Trust." Toren folded his arms. "And the connection to us?" Darren tapped twice. Brevik Thorn, former exec at Corven, suspended last year after leaking internal flight security protocols. Then resurfaced quietly under a shell that supplies Chrysonic's elite fleet staffing. A pause. A silence charged with implication. "He's the one who got Kellen on our plane," Toren said low. "Not directly," Darren replied. The reference letter used was digitally signed by a third-party HR firm, but the metadata matches a Chrysonic board channel. Toren's eyes narrowed. "Which board member?" Darren hesitated, then pressed a button. A name appeared on the center screen. Aldrich Velson. Toren stared at it. Velson, elegant, polished, legacy-funded, had always stayed on the edge of the real action. A strategist. A whisperer. He had publicly supported the merger, yet always privately questioned the bloodline clause, a contingency plan in the merger deal that funneled voting control to Toren's next of kin in the event of a sudden incapacity or death. Few knew about it. Even fewer had access to the equity trigger logs. But Aldrich did. Toren stepped away from the screen and paced the room. "If Corven dies," he began. "The transition stalls," Darren finished. "Shareholder vote is reinitiated. Your hold weakens." Toren stopped. He looked not at the screen, but through it, through the layers of manipulation, into the cold architecture of betrayal. "So that's what this was," he murmured. "Not an attack. An equation." Darren nodded. "Remove the air, and the formula breaks." Toren didn't speak for a moment. He moved to the glass wall overlooking the lab floor, where engineers were testing biometric response modules, an innovation he'd personally championed. So many systems he built were designed to detect threats from the outside. But this one? This had come from within. He turned, his voice calm but searing. "They used my child as a stop-loss." Darren remained silent. He had seen men react in rage, in grief, in panic. But Toren was something else entirely. Calculating, steady, but every line in his face drawn with a weight of fury he kept locked behind discipline. "We bring this to the board?" Darren asked. Toren shook his head. "Not yet. First, I want a list of every file Aldrich accessed in the last 3 months. Every shadow login. Every vendor change. Darren hesitated. That might flag us internally. I don't care, Toren said. Pull in Halvix from compliance, but keep it clean. If I find one leak, we go dark op with exfil methods. He turned toward the data wall again, fingers brushing his chin. And Brevik? In the wind. Last seen in Sornel province, boarding under a pseudonym. Find him. And the shell that hired Kellen. Burn the chain from the bottom up. The room went still. Orders given. No jilling. No dramatics. Just direction. Toren walked back toward the cradle in the hospital feed. Live on a side monitor. Corven sleeping peacefully beneath the soft blue of a healing canopy. He touched the screen for a moment. Darren watched from behind, uncertain whether to speak. Then Toren said it, voice quiet, almost too soft to hear. If they think my son was leverage, he told Darren, they're about to meet the man who trained the scale. Aldrich Velson's name lit up across 3 internal chrysonic terminals the moment Toren Vallis executed protocol Ravenlock. There was no warning, no preambit, just a single keystroke, and then the digital guillotine dropped. In the executive command hub of Chrysonic Tower, silence fell as the system override propagated. Monitors flashed red across the boardroom. Voting privileges suspended. Velson A. The legal division gasped. Aldrich's shareholder access, committee input, and boardroom proxy controls were frozen under Article 7 of the corporate charter, conflict of interest probe activation. Toren stood by the central console, his reflection split across the glossy security glass. He didn't flinch. His eyes tracked the cascading revocations as the protocol's clauses unfurled. Ravenlock was a fail-safe, buried, undisclosed, known only to 3 living chrysonic officials. And now, activated for the first time in company history, for betrayal from within. Aldrich, who had once chaired the Ethical Vendor Council, who had toasted Toren's wedding, hadn't anticipated the speed of retaliation. That morning, he'd been reviewing legal prep from Veltrin and Marrow. By nightfall, his access badge read, Observer Only. It wasn't just a slap, it was a strategic exile. Across town, reporters were already asking questions. Why has one of Chrysonic's lead shareholders been suspended from the vote matrix? Are there allegations of internal collusion? Toren said nothing publicly, but behind closed doors, he prepared his next move. He summoned Thalen Voss. Thalen entered the penthouse command suite at dusk, dressed not in his usual compliance regalia, but in a civilian blazer, unbranded. Toren handed him a sealed dossier with the Chrysonic watermark embossed deep into the carbon paper spine. You've read Kellen's legal filings? Toren asked. Scrubbed twice. There's coordination above his pay grade, Thalen replied. Toren leaned in, eyes burning beneath the overhead LEDs. Veltrin and Marrow, get inside. I don't care what title you use, shadow associate, auditor intern. I want ears inside Kellen's defense. Not to break it, to understand who's fueling it. And if it links back to Aldrich, it already does. But I don't chase ghosts, Toren said. He placed a slim voice recorder beside the dossier. Find the silence between their arguments. It's where the truth whispers. Thalen nodded, a slow, solemn motion. What's the cover? You're a legal ethics consultant from Triven Exchange. No paper trail. I've burned the ID once we're done. Thalen left within the hour, boarding a red-eye to Veltrin and Marrow's East Branch under his new alias. Meanwhile, Aldrich attempted damage control, frantically placing calls to Chrysonic's General Counsel, then to third-party mediators. None answered. Ravenlock was designed to lock not just systems, but relationships. Every protocol freeze triggered automatic disclosure warnings to affiliated partners. Within 12 hours, Aldrich became an uninsurable liability. Days passed with silence. Then Thalen called from a secure line. I found something, he said, his voice low. Kellen's defense isn't just over-resourced. It's surgical. They're citing classified compliance loopholes, ones only someone with internal merger knowledge could prepare. Toren's pulse ticked. Aldrich, more than that. There's a code name buried in their private firm logs. Viren. Toren stiffened. Viren. Sealed file. Internal tag. Correspondence. AV to Viren. Quarterlies Q3. Q4. Encrypted access only. I couldn't break the firewall without alerting them. Toren walked to the corner window, looking down at the city he helped build, its lights indifferent, its skyline oblivious to betrayal. He spoke calmly, yet every word struck like iron. We're no longer playing defense. His fingers traced the edge of Corven's hospital photo taped beneath the glass. A reminder, not of weakness, but of why he'd never allow silence to win again. Give me everything on Viren, not the voice, the echo, the trail that proves someone spoke, then tried to erase the words. What if it's deeper than Aldrich? Phelan asked. What if Viren isn't a man, but a firewall? Then we find who built it. The line went dead. Toren turned back toward the command suite, where a holographic board displayed the live operational grid of every chrysonic aircraft, asset, and partner node. Red lines circled Veltrin and Marrow, Corven Aero Trust, and now, a blinking dot labeled Unknown, marked only with the initials V. Toren pressed his palm to the biometric pad, opening a secure folder titled Project Ashlock. If you want to kill a lie, he said aloud, you must follow the silence, not the shouting. The attendant smirked, certain his position on the crew would shield him, unaware that every second of that fall was being recorded, reported, and quietly fueling the CEO's calculated fury. If you believe cruelty under a uniform always folds when strategy meets unstoppable resolve, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. The door slammed behind Kellen Dray with a finality that echoed through the federal holding chamber. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile hue across the interrogation room's gray walls. Across from him sat two federal agents, silent, composed, their eyes locked on the man who had, until days ago, served drinks on private jets. Kellen's face was pale, lips cracked, fingers twitching as he fumbled with the edge of the metal table. For hours he had insisted on his innocence, on the accident narrative. But now, cornered by cross-reference surveillance, digital footprints, and mounting federal charges, his resolve broke. I didn't know the stairwell would be open, he muttered, almost to himself. One of the agents leaned forward. Then who did? Kellen swallowed hard. His shoulders sagged, as if surrendering to a weight he could no longer carry. I was paid to cause a scene, to drop the baby. Not kill him. Just trigger something. Sympathy, scandal, I don't know, leverage. But the placement at the stairwell? That wasn't mine. Someone else set that. The agents exchanged a glance. That admission changed the scale of the case. It was no longer about one desperate man. It was about orchestration from above. Kellen, whether knowingly or not, had been a puppet, and someone had pulled the strings with precision. Hours later, in his glass-walled command room above Chrysonic Tower, Toren Vallis listened in silence to the full interrogation playback. His expression remained unreadable. Beneath his fingertips, the desk glowed softly with cascading streams of security reports and compliance alerts. When Kellen's words played, someone else set that. Toren closed his eyes, let the moment settle, then opened a secure channel to Thalen Voss. Leak it, he said. Every word. No attribution. Send it to the Independent Aviation Ethics Board and the Commercial Sky Trust. Make sure it gets legs. Thalen didn't hesitate. Understood. Within 48 hours, the leak spread like fire through industry back channels. Media anchors picked it up with phrases like possible conspiracy in high airspace and CEO's child used as leverage. Experts weighed in on biometric protocols. Talk shows debated corporate sabotage. Toren, meanwhile, said nothing publicly. The silence was deliberate, a pressure vacuum waiting to collapse. But the game wasn't over. Not yet. Miles away, on a remote stretch of Curvada Isles, Aldrich Velson lounged in the balcony of a private villa, sipping chilled tonic from a crystal glass. The ocean shimmered beneath him, as if mocking the chaos erupting on the mainland. His phone, though on silent, lit up in irregular intervals, missed calls, flagged emails, urgent messages from legal teams. He ignored most. He had planned this. When the pressure rose, he'd vanish. Lay low. Resurface later, scrubbed clean. What he hadn't planned for was Jaren Halst. Jaren, once a silent investor and longtime confidant of Aldrich, had received an untraceable package 3 days ago, a full immunity clause from Toren's legal counsel. The offer was simple: cooperate, testify if needed, and walk away untouched. At first, Jaren hesitated. He valued loyalty. But loyalty, he decided, wasn't worth much when a man you were loyal to nearly dropped a baby for boardroom leverage. That night, under cover of darkness, Jaren booked a secure call. "I have what you need," he told Toren. "The access pin to Viren's offshore server." Toren didn't flinch. "You're sure it's real?" "It was used to initiate the override key timing during the flight. You'll see it. It's all there." Toren stood slowly from his chair, hands behind his back, gaze fixed on the moonlit skyline beyond the tower window. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Toren replied, voice calm and low. "We're not leaking anymore. We're lighting the fire." That fire came in the form of the Corven dossier. It went live at precisely 8 o'clock Universal Time, coordinated on a Tuesday morning. No press release, no warning, just a quiet link posted to a secure public ledger, a 96-slide digital evidence pack, cross-referenced, time-stamped, and cryptographically signed by Chrysonic's legal team. Within minutes, the air in multiple corporate towers across 3 countries shifted. Men in suits paused in glass offices. Monitors blinked with red flag alerts. The file was unmistakable in tone and design. It bore no logo, just the title in bold, the Corven dossier. Inside, page after page dismantled the conspiracy in brutal clarity. The biometric override logs showed the precise moment someone had accessed the cradle lock system, overriding Dr. Toren Vallis' parental code. The timestamps matched Kellen Dray's positioning to the second. Overlaid security footage illustrated his path to the stairwell and the mechanical precision of his pivot before the drop. Then came the forged documents, Kellen's fake employment references, manipulated background checks, and inserted timestamps showing back-end edits to his file, all traced back to Corven Aero Trust data wing. Financial trails emerged next. Offshore transfers in staggered batches, small enough to evade bank flags, but unmistakably timed around Kellen's placement and Aldrich Velson's private asset movements. For every dollar sent, there was a behavioral trigger. A trip, a call, a new asset registration. By slide 37, the audience, be it journalist, investor, or regulator, had already drawn the conclusion. This wasn't carelessness. It was planned. Redacted only to protect child privacy protocols, the file named names. Viren's shareholders, code authors, shell directors, the fake HR approver. Even the server pings that matched logins to known IPs inside Veltrin and Marrow's litigation arm. The courtroom hadn't even opened, but the trial had begun in the court of public trust. By hour 2, Chrysonic stock dipped nearly 6%. By hour 4, it rebounded 12% and kept rising. The turning point came when Toren emerged from behind a sealed glass platform inside Chrysonic HQ's press hall. He wore no tie. The image of Corven's baby cradle, once bloodied and cracked, hovered behind him as a hologram, now redesigned with a dual-ring biometric shield. "I'm not interested in ruin," Toren began, voice low, calm but cutting. "I'm interested in prevention. We've built jets that can evade radar, satellites that can watch nations blink, and capsules that can survive re-entry from space. But a baby was dropped in a stairwell because someone thought no one would trace the why." Reporters sat motionless. The cameras clicked without flash. "I was told it would be easier to settle," he continued, pacing once, then turning to the audience again, "that some files weren't worth opening. But my son's cries are a file I'll never archive. If the skies aren't safe for a child, then no one deserves to fly above the law." Then came the announcement, clear, without theatrical buildup. "We're launching a new division," Toren said. "It's called SKYVULT. It won't be for the elite. It won't be for optics. It will be the first zero-compromise security and ethics protocol in private aviation, designed for the smallest passengers and the biggest stakes." The news cycle fractured. One major outlet dubbed it the biometric reckoning. Another called it the flight that changed aerospace. Interviews with aviation families who had lost children to in-air negligence suddenly resurfaced. Pilots, engineers, and whistleblowers began submitting anonymous entries to a new Skyvault intake portal that Toren's team quietly deployed the same evening. Meanwhile, Aldrich Velson, still abroad when the dossier dropped, was forced to return under summons. His return flight was met by federal agents. He stepped off the plane, not to cameras, but to a quiet legal escort. Breivik Thorne, the security breach operative, was less cautious. He attempted to board a commercial flight using a falsified alias, Peter Marlin, but the alias had been flagged by one of Skyvault's preliminary AI monitors within minutes. He was pulled from the gate by two plainclothes investigators. As the sun set that evening over Norvane Bay, Toren watched the horizon from his office. His phone buzzed with market reports. Chrysonic shares had hit a new 18-month high. But it wasn't the stock that made him stare out into the sky. It was the feeling that something greater had taken off, something harder to measure than equity. Reassurance. Legacy. Correction. He opened a secured tablet, checked the incoming entries to Skyvault's anonymous registry, and saw the first dozen. Stories from other fathers, other flights, other overlooked incidents. It was already working. Then he stood, rolled his sleeves, and whispered beneath his breath, "If the skies aren't safe for a child, then no one deserves to fly above the law." Toren Vallis didn't hesitate. The Cradle X capsule had barely finished diagnostics when he ordered the retrofit team to clear the hangar bay. Engineers scurried out, still holding blueprints. Alone now, with the prototype, Toren stood inside the customized Decelera GT, the same jet where his son had nearly died. He placed the capsule on the center platform and powered it manually, bypassing the remote sync. Lights blinked blue. The system came alive with a soft chime, its interface waiting for an infant biometric imprint. Toren gently placed Corven's most recent health scan band beside it, watching as the cradle word, adjusted, then locked with a reassuring mechanical click. It wasn't fear that brought him here, it was resolve. But his hands trembled anyway. He sat beside the capsule, staring at the datapad. The last trace pinged before the stairwell override. The one fragment that hadn't mapped back to any known entity. Just a designation, BRK9X. The broker. That phantom identity had haunted every log, every trace, every signal they had followed. Even Linux Braid, with his unmatched server forensics, couldn't penetrate it. Whoever the broker was, he had cloaked himself under dozens of offshore firms, scrambled IPs, false credential pings, and yet one thread had surfaced. A digital residue matching the settlement templates used by Veltrin and Marrow. It was Thalen Voss who had brought it to light, after months of quiet infiltration and quieter listening. And now Toren knew, this wasn't just an outsider playing puppet master. This was someone inside the legal engine room. He turned to Thalen, who stood at the edge of the cabin. "You're certain it's internal?" Toren asked quietly. Thalen nodded once, solemn. "I tracked 3 legal settlements used to silence whistleblowers. Each one cross-referenced under casework flagged by V. Dorn, Veltrin's silent partner. But that name doesn't exist in firm records. Internal chatter refers to him only once, in coded backup logs. A contract where his name is mentioned as a strategic terminal point. That's a broker term." Toren folded his arms, the chill of the hangar air setting into his sleeves. "So he's not a hacker. He's a tactician. Legal warfare." "Exactly. And he didn't target Corven randomly. He exploited a loophole in parental override security. He tested our biometric trust. And he bet we'd never catch the angle." Toren stared back at the capsule, glowing, silent, protective. He was almost right. The wind outside howled against the hangar doors. Inside, silence pressed like a sealed chamber. Toren exhaled slowly, thinking, if V. Dorn was the broker, then the structure of betrayal was deeper than a single fall. This had been architectural from the start, a system designed not to attack, but to delay, to disable, to disqualify. Every delay in biometric clearance, every forged reference, every carefully timed settlement was a calculated brick in the structure. But Toren hadn't just built defenses. He had built legacies. And now he understood. Revenge was never about punishing the moment. It was about redesigning the future. "We need to verify settlement lineage," he said to Thalen. "Every case Veltrin handled in the last 10 years, especially the sealed ones." "I already started," Thalen replied. "Half of them were closed under arbitration codes that match our override exploit. He's been hiding behind conflict resolution for years. Then he's overdue for one." Toren opened a private channel to Linux. "Can we trace arbitration closures by digital handling sequence?" "Yes," Linux responded instantly. "But it'll take time. He's buried deep." "We dig," Toren said flatly. Hours passed. The hangar remained closed, no interruptions. Engineers stayed off-site under the guise of system cleanse. In that solitude, Toren reviewed the chain again, footage of the fall, logs of the override, the forged reference letters metadata. He laid it all on a single master timeline. One gap, one sliver of unclaimed coordination. Whoever the broker was, he had made one mistake. His burner profile had logged into a resource library hosted on a Chrysonic sandbox server, the kind used during mergers for testing legal language compliance. That login had occurred 4 days before Kellen Dray was hired. "Found you," Toren murmured. "You touched our language." Linux confirmed it moments later. The sandbox login tied to a server ping that matched the location of Veltrin's offshore legal mirror. Toren stood and moved to the capsule, placing one hand on its reinforced shell. "This ends soon," he said, voice low. That night, back in Corven's nursery, Toren watched his son reach upward with both hands, finally gripping his mobile spinner with full strength again. The bruises had faded. The cast had been removed. The fingers now curled naturally, firmly, life restored not just in motion, but in trust. Toren leaned down beside the crib, his voice quiet but certain. "They try to drop you from my hands. Now I've dropped them from the skies." The room had already fallen silent when the tribunal chair called the session to order. Rows of mahogany benches faced the front of the chamber, where a long panel of federal adjudicators, each selected from the Aviation Conduct Oversight Division, sat behind elevated desks. The seal of the Federal Aviation Conduct Authority loomed on the wall behind them, flanked by 2 silent flags. This was no ordinary hearing. This was a reckoning. Dr. Toren Vallis stepped forward to the testimony podium, the lights catching the hard set of his jaw. He didn't glance at the cameras. He didn't clear his throat. He began with no preamble. "This tribunal was not called because of a systems failure," he said. "It was called because someone deliberately used our systems to attempt the erasure of a life that had only just begun." He inserted a drive into the port beside him. The screen behind the panel flickered to life, displaying the digital cover of the Corven dossier. For the next several minutes, the room watched in silence as excerpts played, metadata trails, falsified credentials, internal correspondences, and finally the footage. Toren played it 3 times. First, the standard speed, Kellen Dray exiting the forward galley with Corven in his arms, heading toward the rear stairwell. Second, a slowed replay, the subtle shift of Kellen's heel, the pivot that betrayed muscle memory rather than panic. His hand opened slightly, not slipped, not yanked. Opened. Third, a zoomed-in frame-by-frame breakdown. The absence of urgency on Kellen's face. The cold precision of the drop. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. One of the adjudicators, a grizzled man named Varen Holt, leaned forward and murmured audibly. He didn't even look at the child's face. Toren didn't respond. He simply let the silence bloom. He then turned to face the panel directly. "This wasn't an accident. It was a message. But I've written back, and this time the ink is fire." A ripple of unease moved through the room. Observers scribbled notes. Regulatory agents exchanged glances. Behind Toren sat Kellen Dray, shackled, pale, and unmoved. He stared ahead, not remorseful, not defiant, just empty. The prosecution wasted no time. Evidence from offshore transfers corroborated Kellen's involvement in a coordinated act of corporate sabotage. The digital trail was irrefutable. But it was Toren's cross-linking of biometric override logs with executive access protocols that sealed the matter. Then came the second hammer. Aldrich Velson. Toren presented signed authorization forms, emails time-stamped minutes before Kellen's assignment was approved, and a redacted chain of internal board messages where Aldrich had waved off concerns about security verifications. "It's internal," he had typed. "No need for extra flags." The panel recessed for 2 hours. When they returned, the gravity in the room shifted. Presiding Judge Kellen Dray read the decision in a slow, steady voice. "Kellen Dray, you are hereby sentenced to 18 years under corporate malfeasance and endangerment statutes. You knowingly endanger the life of an infant with premeditated action for financial gain and coercion." Kellen flinched slightly as the gavel struck, but his face remained neutral. Then Judge Dray turned to Aldrich Velson, who stood at the defense podium with a rigid spine and white-knuckled fists. "Mr. Velson, for gross negligence, abuse of executive authority, and facilitation of a high-risk conflict of interest scheme, you are stripped of all board privileges, banned from holding any corporate executive role in perpetuity, and referred for additional review by the Federal Ethics Tribunal." The courtroom buzzed with reaction, quiet words, stifled gasps, a flurry of note-taking. But the moment that would be remembered, the one that would be replayed in news clips for weeks, was when the panel allowed Toren to play the final footage once more. The slow motion of Kellen's pivot, the baby's tiny frame falling, vanishing out of the stairwell's view, and the lines spoken not from rage, but from quiet disbelief. "This child survived not just gravity," Judge Dray said, eyes narrowed, but betrayal. Toren's closing remarks came with no raised voice, no triumphant posture, just a soft steadiness that somehow commanded more power than any outrage. "We build systems," he said, "to transport, to protect, to rise. But if those systems can be hijacked from within, if the seat beside us becomes more dangerous than the world below, then we haven't risen at all. Let this case mark the altitude where decency begins." 3 months later, the lights dimmed over the chrysonic launch platform. The air was sharp, the silence waiting to be broken. No fanfare, no music, just the presence of power earned, not gifted. Dr. Toren Vallis stepped forward, the storm of past weeks contained behind calm eyes. He didn't bring Corven scans. He didn't bring evidence folders. What he brought was a prototype. A single unit sat center stage beneath a circular spotlight, sleek, matte black, with softly glowing blue biometric rings pulsing along its cradle frame. It was the Cradle X, designed not to impress, but to prevent trauma, prevent tampering, prevent any child from being made a pawn again. Toren pressed a button on the side. The cradle's arms expanded with a low hiss, forming a precise curvature that mimicked the position Corven had fallen from. The room held its breath. The demonstration had no narration. Instead, a visual simulation rolled behind him on the holoscreen, a real-time reenactment of an unauthorized handover. The system responded instantly. An internal lock engaged, a silent alert pinged to the cockpit, and a warning capsule sealed shut with foam rib compression. When the sequence ended, the screen displayed only 2 words: "Transfer denied." The applause that followed was brief, sharp, and respectful. Federal regulators and aviation leaders were in attendance. But Toren didn't address them first. Instead, he turned to his staff seated near the front. Men who had stayed when it would have been easier to resign. Men who had secured servers in the rain, reconstructed wiped logs, and stared down lawyers without blinking. "Revenge," Toren said, his voice low and clear, "isn't destruction." He looked across the floor, locking eyes with every team leader, its correction with memory. Behind him, a mechanical wall segment slid open. Slowly, a silver foil mural unfurled, an exact outline of Corven's infant hand, framed by arcs of cascading data, strings etched into the alloy. Underneath, the team's signature rings glowed with their IDs. Not titles, not departments, just names. Toren had chosen each one for this wall himself. He let the moment settle. Then came the second half of the event. Less publicized, more personal. Downstairs, in a smaller briefing bay, Toren walked into a room where select regional leaders, program officers, and charity advocates had gathered. The atmosphere here was different, curious, uncertain. Toren didn't begin with slides. "I know what it means to hold your child," he said, motioning gently to Corven in a carrier held by his assistant, and wonder whether the system was ever built for them. He stepped beside a digital display of flight schedules, each marked with an overlay icon, a cradle, a medical heart, or a neurological spark. The crowd didn't understand at first. Then he explained, Chrysonic was launching a pilot initiative. Private craft equipped with security-enabled systems would now be made available to children with medical or special needs. No premium, no strings, just protection. "For too long," he said, his hand resting on the console, "safety has been a luxury of the privileged. But if the sky only belongs to the privileged," his gaze swept the room, "then we've grounded our humanity." A soft murmur rose from the crowd. One logistics manager quietly wiped his eye. Another clasped his colleague's shoulder, nodding. Toren moved to the front, where a ceremonial ribbon waited beneath the Chrysonic emblem. Corven, now more alert, reached out instinctively as Toren knelt beside him. The boy's tiny fingers wrapped around his father's thumb, not weakly, but with purpose. The room stilled. Toren smiled, placed the ribbon scissors down, and let Corven's hand press the button that split the band. The ribbon parted cleanly. In that precise instant, it was no longer about tech, or revenge, or recovery. "This," Toren whispered, leaning close to his son as camera shutters clicked and the crowd stood to applaud, "is how we write safety into the sky." The stairwell bay of KR-1V was quiet now. Not sterile, just still. No alarms, no screams, no crying. Just the soft hum of the aircraft's auxiliary power system and the hiss of pressurized air through reinforced vents. The retrofitted hatch bore no signs of the past, save for a faint seam along the frame where the original lock had been replaced with dual biometric seals. It was a different doorway now, but Toren Vallis hadn't come to see the door. He came to stand on the threshold of what could have been the end. He entered slowly, cradling Corven in his arms, the boy's wide eyes scanning the unfamiliar chamber with the curiosity only a 1-year-old could summon. Toren didn't speak. He just knelt, right on the spot where his son had once been found broken and screaming. He let the silence settle, not as a weight, but as a witness. His fingers brushed the floor, and a chill ran through him. Not from a metal, but from memory. He had replayed this location in his mind countless times, but standing here now, with Corven alive and whole in his arms, was different. It wasn't rage that filled him. It was reclamation. Outside, a light breeze swirled across Norvane Bay's airfield, carrying with it the low murmur of a gathered crowd. A stage had been erected near the tarmac where reporters, aviation officials, and survivors' advocates had gathered. But Toren hadn't yet walked out. He remained inside the aircraft, just beneath the retrofitted emergency stairwell, holding the child they once tried to take from him. His breath slowed. His heartbeat matched the rhythm of the auxiliary engine. And then, with a soft nod to himself, he stood. He exited the jet without ceremony. No security escort. No grand entrance. Just a father carrying his son. Corven wore a small silver pin on his onesie, etched with the letters CX for Cradle X. The same technology that now secured this plane. The same safeguard born from betrayal. As they approached the stage, a hush fell over the crowd. No microphones were offered. None were needed. Beside the hangar, the sculpture stood covered in a sky blue drape. A boy, barely 10, walked up and pulled the cloth away, revealing the artwork. A bronze rendering of a man lifting a baby high into the air. Wings formed in silhouette behind them from the arc of 2 stabilizing rudders, symbolizing protection, resilience, and ascent. The plaque beneath read, "They tried to break the bond, but the sky remembered who he belonged to." Toren stared at it, not with pride, but with resolve. He didn't acknowledge the cameras. He didn't wave. He turned his gaze to Corven, who gurgled in his arms, playing with the edge of Toren's lapel. "He doesn't even remember it," Toren murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. Beside him, a former technician from the day of the fall stepped forward. His name was Merrick Dane, a silent man but loyal, He extended a folded flag, white with 2 cobalt stripes and a silver infant handprint at the center. Toren accepted it, bowing slightly. No words exchanged, only acknowledgement. As the last of the day's sun began to fall behind the ridgeline, the sky painted itself in gold and violet. Toren turned back toward the KR-1V, walking slowly, Corven nestled against his chest once more. Each step was deliberate, not heavy, not triumphant, just grounded. Before boarding, he paused one last time at the foot of the sealed stairwell bay. He looked at the reinforced hatch, then at Corven, then up at the darkening sky. In trying to drop him, Toren said softly, his voice barely above the wind, "They fell. And we rose. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's airborne." Minutes later, the CEO made his move. The crew froze, the jet company panicked, and the attendant realized too late that he hadn't just harmed a child. He had declared war on a man who owns fleets, contracts, and entire boards. Revenge arrived with precision and finality. If you believe real authority protects its own with unshakable strength, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores racism, abuse of authority, and the consequences that follow when arrogance meets accountability. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, respect, and protecting the vulnerable in every situation.